The first thing I'll say is hi, I am Matt. I am one of the co-chairs of SIG Apps. With me is Adnan. He's one of the other co-chairs. Ken couldn't be here this week, but he is the third co-chair. He's out of Google. And so we are the co-chairs. So if you have questions after this, feel free to track us down. We're happy to point you in the right place and in the right direction with any of this stuff, but we kind of have been overseeing SIG Apps. So this is what SIG Apps does and what it's responsible for. Scopes and things have changed. SIG Apps has been around for a few years. Helm used to be part of it, but it became so big it spurred off into its own CNCF project. And these days, this is what we have. And so things like the Workloads API. And it actually goes a little bit beyond that, but the Workloads API is one of the things that we're responsible for. And we'll call it tools and documentation to aid the ecosystem, around interoperability. So we're not trying to do the ecosystem or have all the ecosystem projects be in SIG Apps, but there's lots of places where, well, two tools want to work in the same space and they want to be interoperable with each other. Maybe you want to deploy something with one tool and then have the structure of that visualized in another tool, and they're entirely unrelated projects. That's one thing that falls into the scope of SIG Apps. How do we do that, and how do we get different organizations to negotiate to come up with that same thing around interoperability? The third thing is grandfathered projects, and right now we have Compose. It's like Docker Compose, but it's for Kubernetes. And so that's another project that technically falls under this, although Adnan and I haven't had much to do with it in quite a long time. We just solve solving app development and deployment problems, and what do you do around that? How do you go about problem solving? How do you go about doing these things? And then how do we share some of that knowledge? And then in the rest of the community, whether we're at SIG Architecture or someplace else, we represent app developers and app operators because the persona, the role, it's really different from that of, well, a cluster operator or an infrastructure developer. We do things very, very differently if you're doing app development and operation. And if you saw the Stripe keynote the other night, they talked about not exposing Kubernetes to their app developers, to their app operators. And one of the examples they gave was for cron, they had this short YAML file. That's all they had to do. They didn't have to do cron jobs or any of these other things. It was very short and to the point. And they had a small Python subset language that they could declare what an application needed to do, and then they transformed that into everything that they needed. It's similar to SciCube and Kedge and some other projects that have been around Kubernetes for a while. And they looked at what does that experience look like, because they wanted to minimize the Kubernetes knowledge. And if you're an infrastructure operator, if you're an infrastructure developer, you actually have to maximize that knowledge. And so it's a different persona to bring to the table. So when we go to other meetings, whether you're just a co-chair or whether you're just anybody who's around SIG Apps, we try to represent who those people are and how they're different and how their experience needs are different. And so what is a deep dive? Some people just give talks in their deep dives, but this was the recommendation given to anybody doing deep dives on how to do it. It's an opportunity for us to discuss things, to problem solve, to come together to figure something out, not just a process discussion, but have a technical debate, get into some details, figure out some needs, not just stand up here where we give another talk on something. So it's an opportunity for you to engage. And so with that, I wanted to put up what SIG Apps is working on right now. We obviously have the Workloads API, things like stateful set, daemon set, deployments, and things around that. There's even some other things that we'll get into around secrets and some of the things that surround that have to do with applications. There's the application CRD and controller, which is a project we're working on in the Kubernetes SIG's GitHub org. We have something new called portable service definitions. This is that idea of you want to deal with SaaS, you want to work with SaaS, and you want to deploy something that's a cluster of Kubernetes objects and deploy it into, say, AWS. Then deploy that same group of things with no changes into Azure. Maybe take that same group of things and deploy it into Minikube. And in all places, you want to interact with a SaaS, I'll call it. If you're in Amazon, it would be RDS you'll want it to interact with. And locally, you'll just want to spin up maybe a MySQL cluster. right? But you don't want to keep changing and deal with that orchestration. You want it to be declarative, like other things. You can't quite get this with Service Catalog, and we've been working on it with some Service Catalog folks. And so it's the idea of how do you figure that out? We started with a Kubernetes enhancement proposal, which was merged as provisional, and now we've got to go figure out the architecture and how we're going to build this. But that's one of the things we're on. We're also talking about how do we enable the ecosystem, and then we did an application survey in 2018, and there are folks who are asking and want to talk about, are we going to do this again, or should somebody else do it? So we do have that as well. And so with that, my question is, I've got things that I can talk about with you all and questions we can get going, but what do you want to talk about? What kinds of things? Does anybody in the room have something they would like to talk about? Okay, I will start here. Yeah? I will walk around.
Thank you. One of the issues I hit as a user is I would like to use deployments. We have the story of all the, it generates a replica set and all the pods of the replica set are immutable and identical, except pretty much everyone I deploy, that doesn't hold true because I have a config map or a secret. And the lifecycle of the config map doesn't follow the lifecycle of the replica set. So I'd like some way to, when I update the deployment, it snapshots the config maps in time along with the replica set and make sure that the replica set members all have the same config. And when you roll forward and roll back, it's always consistent.
Okay. Consistent. Okay, so we'll talk about that. I actually want to capture, what was it you wanted to talk about? I want to see what things, and we can start rolling through some of them.
I just wanted, it's probably a really dumb question. Do you guys also do the batch API? Is that part of the Apps SIG?
Yes, it is. That's jobs and cron jobs. In fact, cron jobs is the only thing that is not GA within all the workloads things that we do. And we know what we need to do to take it GA, and we're looking for help in doing some coding. So if any of you want to get involved, this is a perfect area.
Let's lead to the next one. So since you do capture batch jobs, one of the problems that we're having is when we try to declare a job, it immediately runs. But sometimes that's not always what you want. Sometimes you want it to run at a later date or like when you decide to trigger it. So being able to define a job without actually running it, and then later on being able to run it when you decide that that trigger should be going is something that we kind of need to figure out.
Okay, fantastic. Again, I'm just trying to collect these so we get them at the front.
Hi, David Eustace from Google. I'm curious if there are any reactions to the cloud native application bundle that Microsoft and Docker, I believe, announced.
All right, and there was one more. Oh, fantastic. I'm coming.
I'd be really curious about what ideas people have for evolving the future of the deployment object. I think we're seeing at KubeCon this year that a lot of people are writing custom deployment takes on deployments to do like Canary or Blue Green. And the current API doesn't really let you do that without some very delicate pause dancing.
Oh, fantastic.
We are working on an application, and we ran into a problem where two stateful sets should be able to share the same persistent volume on a node. That is not possible, so we want to know, are there any things that are coming out from the stateful set around this area?
All right, were there any others? I've got 5 topics here. Oh, perfect. Here we go, another one.
Thanks. I was just wondering if there's any interest or attention on hot patch of certain aspects of pods and deployments, particularly things like config. I also share interest in the separate config lifecycle from app lifecycle discussion. And one way to view that is, can a config map simply get hot patched in potentially without restarting the pods? It's very expensive to restart pods in some cases.
All right. All right, so are there any, oh, one more, excuse me.
I'd like to see as close as possible parity between a stateful set and a deployment. There are some things that could quite easily be equivalents. For example, things like volume claim templates could exist in a deployment that don't. And the idea is that hopefully that you'll be able to switch between one or the other with some small variations.
All right. Oh, another one. All right. We've got quite a list here.
Yeah, sorry if this has been asked, but I'd like to know the role of the application controller. And right now it's just like a main file that does nothing. So.
All right. Are there any others? And we start rolling through these. All right, fantastic. The first one was config map lifecycles. All right. So this one talked about deployments and to replicate sets and the config map lifecycle. And I don't know if you have anything to add on this, but the thing that I know is there's a KEP, a Kubernetes enhancement proposal by Janet, who works at Google, so config maps and secrets, which are special in Kubernetes because you can mount them and do things with them. They're special, and we've got to treat them that way for how everything interacts. You can't go create a custom resource that can do the same things. But they don't have that same kind of life cycle, the roll forward, roll back. So many people change names. So if you do something like in Helm, and you do an update, Helm would create a new config map with a slightly different name, and you would have the two of them there, and the old one would use the old config map, and the new release would use the new config map. And once everything that used the old release went away, the other config map could be taken down too.
Helm today is just going to delete the old one and break everything.
So one of the things that's being worked on, and there's an enhancement proposal for this from Janet, who's been very busy, is to be able to give other objects details around garbage collecting. And so you could say, when nothing else depends on this anymore, garbage collect it. Or a certain period of time after nothing depends on it, because of course we want to do rollbacks, right? So we might want to get rid of it and say, okay, we're going to wait a week and then we'll just clean it up in case we have to do a rollback, or we'll wait an hour or a day. And you can make this configurable. And she's been working through an enhancement proposal about what can we do and layer on as additional metadata to say, how do you garbage collect this? Because if you're using owner references, you can say where it falls in that tree, and it can be garbage collected when its parent thing is removed, and you can use owner references, but they usually don't have owner references. Like the way pods do all the way up through deployments. You get to delete a deployment and everything underneath it is cleaned up because of owner references. Well, something like a config map or a secret doesn't have that. So how do you specify that? And Janet's working on an enhancement proposal to try to solve that. And she's been working through the edge cases and the architecture and things like that with other people who deal with the architecture. And so there are ideas on how to solve it. I would hope it's there later in 2019, but I don't think it's going to move very fast.
I think in 1.12 there's an alpha for that, but specifically for jobs.
Yeah, for jobs, but it doesn't handle some of the others.
I think the idea is to extend that for other resources.
No, there hasn't, and that's because Janet was the driver. And if you don't know, Janet is one of the co-chairs for the China conference and for this conference and for the next European conference. And since she's the driver who's been talking to everybody and has that domain knowledge, and she's been so busy, I would hope that maybe in the start of the year it gets some movement. It'll probably die down again around Europe, and hopefully when she's freed from her things, she can get back involved with it. Contributors. Anybody want to contribute to it and help move it along? A lot of that, reach out to me or Adnan afterwards, and we can get you connected with a context. What this takes is people with knowledge of that problem domain, or people willing to go learn the knowledge of the problem domain, because it's garbage collection around Kubernetes, and that does take a little bit for folks to learn. But anybody who wants to, we can help you learn and get involved, but it takes contributors.
And even if it's just helping reviewing, the proposal and providing feedback on that.
I've done that, and I think there's a couple different ways to really solve this, and the garbage that proposal was very different from the way I solved it. It's not clear what the right way to do it is.
I would say, did you have a comment in the back on this?
Well, I just want to share
Okay, so you've solved it by basically using Helm and wrapping that in a CRD and a controller, and the CRD is the parent object, and then you get the cleanup of it from the owner references. Okay. That's a good idea. Oh, you've got a comment on this? I'm coming. By the way, this is for the recording. The reason I repeat things back and for the mic, more than y'all hearing each other.
Yeah. We don't use Helm, so I don't know if this applies necessarily, but we solved this problem by, worked around it by basically, when we're generating our objects, we have a utility function that will basically hash the name of the config map based on the contents. We've also done this for some other CRDs that we've defined that are also tied to the pod lifecycle. We haven't really figured out the garbage collection thing. I think we've built some janky cron job on our own. But yeah, and another case where this has come up to, I think someone mentioned the hot reloading of configs, and we've actually kind of tried to avoid that because then you kind of lose Kubernetes protections around updates and stuff. It makes it too easy to break all your stuff at once. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're interested in it, come find me also afterwards or after the conference, and we can help get you looped into solving this.
One of the things that I've found as well is if you try to delete a config map and it's being used, it won't get deleted from the API until it stops being used. So one of the ways you can garbage collect is you just go delete all config maps, and then the ones that aren't meant to be deleted will hopefully not be deleted.
Yeah. As far as this goes, but that even gets into the philosophy of Kubernetes, and where we in SIG Apps sometimes struggle with that because we want a simple experience where you don't have to explain much to the users. And many of the Kubernetes infrastructure folks want to let everybody have access to every bell and whistle and knob, and those are kind of opposed, and that's where we get into the UX conversations. So I definitely understand, and yes, afterwards, please come. There are people who want to work on this, and we can kind of get you, anybody who's interested in this, to the right place to help contribute and be productive as part of that. The next thing I had on the list here was the delaying jobs. Adnan, did you have any ideas on how you'd go about doing this?
No, but I was just thinking with the TTL controller, you could have a cron job and then try to delete it after the time that's run. It's a hacky way of doing it. I don't know if there should be a delayed job controller. That could be interesting.
No, so suspending, the problem with suspending is if your schedule is too fast, it'll get to 100 missed schedules and then it'll stop running on the cron job. This is more like, I'd like to create a kind of job template, which you can then continually create new jobs from that have the exact same template. So it just means you don't have to keep redefining all your configuration, all of your secrets and everything that the job template requires every single time you want to run it, but actually every single time you want to make a specific template, and then you can actually just say, hey, look, I want to run this specific thing. The thing you suggested about cron jobs, apparently you can schedule a cron job on a non-existent day, so you can go February 31st, and then apparently you never have it scheduled, but seems like an odd way to do it as well.
So you basically want a job template the way that you've got Knative, you've got a build template. You want exactly that. You want to decouple the actual job from the actual template to do it, and then to bind the two together.
Yeah, so I'll put on my SIG architecture hat for a minute here. SIG architecture is, when it comes to lots of feature requests like this, the philosophy is not in core, let's do it as an extension. Let's let the ecosystem figure out how to do it and share it amongst themselves. So something like this, we're probably not likely to get inside of the core of Kubernetes in the near future. But I totally understand the use case. So my suggestion would be you could create a CRD and custom resources that define this. And then the controller for that could handle that work. And this would be the way to do it. And I would use Kube Builder probably to start going down that road and experiment with that.
So CRDs are something that I've kind of tried to stay away from, even though I still use them for Prometheus operators and stuff. How much buy-in is there for CRDs within the SIG apps? Are you guys just saying, hey, look, any new extensions, no more core at all, keep making CRDs and we'll start supporting those?
So I'll say this isn't a SIG apps thing. The overall architecture for Kubernetes is owned by SIG architecture. And the philosophy that SIG architecture has had for about a year is to move towards anything new like this, do it in the ecosystem and deploy it in. And more so, we want to do that with CRDs and controllers to support them. That's SIG architecture stance. So if we want to get something new like this in, SIG Apps has to go before SIG architecture, and specifically the API reviewers, and get buy-in. So the architecture and the API has to go in. And right now, the answer is almost always no, do it in the ecosystem. And people have heard a lot of no's when they go to SIG architecture to ask for permission on this. So that's kind of the general philosophy, because Kubernetes wants to slow down all of the new features and add them into the ecosystem and let people develop on top of Kubernetes, but make Kubernetes more extensible. So we want to get CRDs and controllers to GA. We want to make that more of a GA thing and solve all of the hard problems around them. So we can expand, because Kubernetes, we don't want to be a bottleneck, and we don't want the community around just the core of it to be a bottleneck. We want to be an enabler. Does that help? All right, I think the next one was what, CNAB?
CNAB, yep.
All right. Adnan, can you give here, I'll pull it up. Who in here knows what CNAB is? All right. Do you remember what the domain is?
Yeah, CNAB.io, I think.
Was it IO? They always buy the SH domain, so. All right. All right.
Yep. Yeah, so CNAB is basically a spec for packaging distributed apps. It's not specific to Kubernetes. It's actually kind of, I guess, higher level than that. And there's a spec right now, and if you go to CNAB.io, you can find a GitHub repository for that. And then there's also Duffel, which is an implementation of the spec. And I think that one is duffel.sh. I can't remember what the original question was.
You were interested in what people thought of it? Was that it? Okay. So I guess I'll have my quick 2 cents on it. It's a spec on how to install applications, and it's built around the idea of an installer image, and you bundle that up as an OCI compliant image that you can run, and any container runner can do it. And then the spec, there's a reference implementation called Duffel, a VS Code extension. The idea is to keep them separate so that you've got a spec that says, here's how you do things, and then you have implementations that are all compatible with each other as long as they work with the spec. And so they've created a VS Code extension, an installer. They created a UI installer using Electron. So you can have, build a UI, click next and walk through, collect information and install it using Electron. So you can have a variety of different tools as long as they implement the spec. It's kind of a higher level thing though. I don't think there are dependencies. So you say dependencies, you bundle everything in. It has 2 flavors. There's a lightweight where it can go out and fetch things, and then there's a heavyweight where all the images and everything that you're going to ship are bundled into one package and it can deal with, and that lets you do with things like air-gapped environments or edge networks for IoT. And so there's things like that. But it is kind of a higher level spec, and I think some of the examples even will have, say, a Helm chart inside of it or Terraform inside of it. So it's a package manager of package managers, right? So what do you all think of the concept of this?
Could you run that installer image like a controller in Kubernetes?
Is there a better way to approach it? Probably operator, actual CNAB operator, so you can effectively put that operator and have Kubernetes actually building this out for you, which I think would be an incredibly powerful concept. I don't know if it fills into the SIG Apps sort of area, but in some ways it kind of like, it's Helm on steroids.
So is this more kind of back to the old Windows exe installers where the exe itself could do anything and it was very inconsistent versus like RPMs or MSI where there's like known stages and stuff where it's a more well-defined, secure environment?
It's a more well-defined, secure environment, I think. But what you get is consistency, and you can deal with things that are more than that. So say you want to, one of the things we're working on is portable service definitions, and that, orchestrate a SaaS through there. But we don't have a lot of that now. So you could have something that went through and, say, an AWS orchestrated RDS and created a database. And then you could pass that into a Helm chart and then deploy the Helm chart into Kubernetes. And you can use different things talking to different APIs and services to make the whole package installable. You didn't just have to do it one way. And it's not even just Kubernetes specific. You could use this with Mesos or OpenStack or AWS services or a combination of AWS and a third-party service. You can orchestrate all of these things together in one package. And so it deals with that multi-cloud environment. Does that help?
Yeah, there are a couple of things I like about the CNAP spec, and one of them is the way it handles credentials. So you can define your set of credentials on your local machine, and then when you go and do a CNAB install or perform a CNAB operation, it will actually mount in those credentials either via file, environment variables, and you can also set up different runners. So by default, it'll just run a Docker image on your machine, but you can also set it up to run the invocation image in ACI or potentially in Kubernetes as well.
And I do think while I'm walking over here, the path for this is right now is developed originally by Microsoft and Docker, but they are looking to put everything around this into a proper standards organization or open source project to oversee it, so it's not just controlled by those companies.
I'm wondering how this jives with sort of declarative config and customization of off-the-shelf apps.
That's a great question. With this, you can probably do a lot of imperative stuff, and I imagine a lot of people will, because if you're going to do something like, I need to get a database in RDS, to go back to my past example, you're going to create that first, get the credentials out of it, inject those using Helm or Customize or something like that into your Kubernetes stuff to do it. That's very imperative. And there are times right now when you're dealing with multiple services that there isn't another good option to do that easily. And with that, we could talk about, okay, well, you can run a controller and you can write that and you can do this declarative and you can do all these interactions. We're starting to do that with some of our stuff, but it doesn't really exist today. And that may be more complicated for a lot of people than writing a script in an image using some API tools they already know. And that's an easier experience maybe for the developers than writing controllers, running in Kubernetes and doing. So when we start to get new experience, I don't know the answer, the right answer or the best answer, or if there is one. But I see that different paths are being gone down, and I'm curious to see what happens with this from whoever picks it up.
So is this spec imperative or declarative?
Is it imperative or declarative? I would say go read the spec. It's not that long or boring. Or I guess all specs are boring, but I've read it. So the spec is you end up with a container image where you can do what you want on it with certain formats or certain rules, like you have to have something that gets executed at a certain location in it, and it has to know how to take certain details in, like how to respond to certain environmental variables that'll tell you the event. Are you installing? Are you removing? What else are you doing? So you have to do those kinds of things, but otherwise it's up to you. And so you could just use kubectl or kubecontrol, and you could use just a bunch of YAML files and deploy into Kubernetes, and that's perfectly legitimate. You could use Terraform in there, and that's also perfectly legitimate. You could have an entire imperative workflow that you've written yourself that takes in the environmental variables and the config Adnan talked about, and you could act on it and do everything imperative. You could do that too. It leaves it up to you, the end user who's building the packages, to choose. It's an abstraction, yeah. Yes, you're right. There is not an engine outside of the package that takes imperative configuration and makes the state right. It lets you install. Now, if you wanted to give it, just generate those things and send them in, you could do that as well. It is not meant to be that imperative kind of configuration because, quite frankly, to be fault tolerant, to look at the world and all the SaaSes and everything we have out there, we don't have that ability to do that today in a way that's easy for those end users. I mean, that's really a problem. We talk about creating controllers, creating imperative things, CRDs. We're going to build this on top, and then it's going to orchestrate out to other things. They don't exist, and a lot of this is complicated for those end users, but a whole lot of them have done this workflow before where they create an image and you run it and it installs stuff by config. They're familiar with this, and they can use their familiar tools. And so I'm not saying what the right answer is here, but I'm curious to see what happens with this. And a lot of this has to do with the experience.
It seems like I was just in the talk from the API machinery guys, and they talked about running a controller to control an external application, and that kind of envelops what you're talking about, like using Terraform or something that's outside. So it seems like there's a little overlap there.
As with this community, I don't think we will ever find one thing to rule them all. We do lots of things differently, and I expect multiple solutions. And this, by the way, was not just meant with Kubernetes in mind, right? The Docker folks and the Docker apps are looking at how they do this for their stuff, entirely separate from anything Kubernetes related, because this is not a Kubernetes coupled project. All right, we should probably get on to the next thing on the list.
Yes, future of deployment. So I think this was about blue-green deployments.
Blue-green deployments, things like that. And okay,
Canaries.
so canaries, stuff like that. You're probably going to find everything that needs to happen to that will be built on top of it in the near future. At some point, we'll probably roll to version 2 of those APIs. But as I said before, remember, API changes are very hard, and they've got to get authorized through SIG architecture. And so I would just say don't expect those in the next couple of years. But expect those situations. We've had demos in SIG apps of people doing this with tools built on top of it. And that's where I expect the innovation to happen. And if some really good patterns start to evolve and show up there, then we'll look at going to version 2 of the workloads controllers, and we'll be able to bring those in. But I don't expect that to happen in the core of it. But if people have tools to do this, we would love to share. Anything else you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think I agree. Yeah, I think we have seen tools like this in SIG apps, and I think we'll probably open discussion in future meetings as well around on this. But if you have tools that you've developed in-house that are doing this stuff, like we'd love to see that and open the discussion there.
I'm actually going to jump around because I see the time. We're a little short on time now.
Yes.
But we're going into lunch, so you all can stick around and we can continue to chat as we mosey on to lunch. But parity between stateful sets and deployments. I don't know how soon we're going to get to that because of the API changes. If it's additive in a backwards compatible way, we are entirely open to talking about that. And some of those conversations have been happening, and there may even be a KEP or two on adding some of those because there's some features that are in one and not the other. And I think there's a KEP or two out there or a proposal to add some of those features. But as far as mass API changes, I know it's inconsistent. We're probably not going to get that fixed until version 2 of the spec. But if there are ideas and thoughts about it, we'd love to chat about it now and look for both immediate things that people can do and where that can go in the future. Was the stateful set a mistake? Should we have just added it to deployment to have those capabilities? I don't know if I have an opinion on that one. Adnan, do you?
I don't know. I kind of like that the controllers tend to be like very good at doing one specific thing and not trying to do all the different things that people need. And I think that was probably the reason why why we have cron jobs and jobs and why we have stateful set and deployments. But
like the daemon set, it's so close in a way. You're transforming from one to the other one. It's like often just changing the kind and a couple of fields and you're done.
It is, but at the same time, for somebody coming in from the outside and their user experience, what task are they trying to do and what do they need to do to accomplish that task? If you just have one big mass thing, sure, you've got all the knobs and all the configuration there, but we're not thinking about it. What does an end user who's doing this need to accomplish? And how do we make that experience from, I have to learn about this object, I've got to learn about the fields and what's going on with it and accomplish something with it? That's part of the reason it's nice to have different kinds, because you can map it to the kinds of tasks and situations you have to do, and it's that experience. It's not just config in general. It's helping solve for that human experience. What else did we have up there?
Someone had a question about the application CRD.
Yes. What's going on with the application CRD? So the application CRD was originally part of that interoperability task that I talked about before, where you have multiple things. Maybe you deploy an application with a Helm chart or from the Google Marketplace, and you want to visualize it in dashboard and see everything paired together. How do you describe that? How do you list that in a directory, like the metadata that's in a Helm chart YAML? How do you deal with these things and associate stuff? And many tools want to solve this problem, and that's where the application CRD came about. And it's not meant to be an installer or a deployer for anything. There's many third-party tools can do that because our scope is interoperability, not solving all of these problems, especially when the ecosystem wants to, and not everybody wants to be consistent in how they do it because different people have different philosophies. And we want to enable all of those. And so application CRD meant to kind of handle that interoperability. I know for the controller side, we're working on application status and how do we do that? Yeah.
I was going to mention the same thing. There's a PR right now for adding a controller that would essentially aggregate the status of the components of the resource and then expose a application level status based on those components. And another possibility for the controller potentially is to assign owner references of the components to the application as a parent so that you can delete everything together.
Yeah, and so again, this is all around that interoperability. So Helm or the Google Marketplace or anything else that comes along, KSonnet can take advantage of those things.
So, would the end user create an application CRD object themselves, or would the deployment tool be the one creating an application CRD object?
Sure. It could be dependent on the case. You might have a tool that does it transparently and lets them know. You might have another thing where it's a specific object alongside the rest of the things. We're not trying to dictate because just like people want to use different tools for different things, they've got different flows and work styles. And Kubernetes is not trying to be a PaaS and opinionated in how these parts are. It's an intent. If you go to what is Kubernetes, you're actually going to find the things that it's not. And something that's really opinionated like this is something that's listed as one of the things Kubernetes isn't going to do. Because other tools built on top of it will be more opinionated. You know, one of the things that I read about recently was Cloud Foundry can use Kubernetes as a scheduler. And they're working on doing that instead of Diego. Because there's an opinion, but Kubernetes is that scheduler in there. And so the Kubernetes project wants to let other things build on top of it as people want them to be, rather than trying to solve everything for everybody. And so we don't have an opinion on that.
I think just to add my 2 cents to that, I think some tools certainly could, right? Like Helm, for example, already has a lot of that metadata in its chart.yaml. It knows all the resources in that particular chart. So some tools could. But if I was deploying something with kubectl doesn't have all the knowledge that, in terms of metadata that we want to put in the app CRD. So in that case, we might need the user to write the application CRD.
All right, I know we're at time. Were there any other real quick questions? Fantastic. Thank you all for coming. If anybody is interested in contributing or being involved, come let us know. We can get you to the right place. Some of the problems you all have and have talked about, we can help you contribute to improving that, and we're happy to. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.